Ruby?
Hi, Mark. So I'm going to ask you this question on video since it's a lot easier than typing a longer response. But there's a question on one of the training lists about a small dog who's neutered but marks all over the house. And the trainer has done anything and everything that one could imagine: belly bands, diapers, tethering, leashing, crating, in the house, 100% supervision. They've done e-collar work and clicker and correction, and they're really at wit's end and they're out of options. And so on the list, I suggested one thing and you suggested another. Mine was that it sounded like it was really, at this point, if they'd done all of those things, that it was more of an anxiety issue and that they should consider conditioned relaxation. But one of the things you do a lot of is punishment by reward. And so what you suggested is that you could click and reward the minute that the dog starts marking to interrupt the behavior. So we got a response that said, wouldn't a click reward during the marking effectively encourage more marking? That's how you teach a dog novel behavior, like shake it off, or at least that's how that person does it. Why would clicking and rewarding the marking decrease the behavior? And I think that's a totally reasonable question.
Well, it's absolutely a reasonable question, because the general idea when we bridge, whether the bridge is a yes or the bridge is a clicker or the bridge is good, and then we reward, the basic idea of bridging and rewarding a behavior is to get more of it. So it's a completely reasonable question. And frankly, my solution sounds idiotic, but I'll explain. But the first thing I want to say is I totally agree that conditioned relaxation could help quite a bit. And most of the answers that people make to a question like this, I don't know about most, but a lot of the answers people make are related to the idea that the animal has some kind of stress and anxiety, and you should try to remove that underlying stress or anxiety. So that's absolutely true. You should do anything that would do that. Conditioned relaxation could certainly be one thing that could help to do that. It's important to understand that marking is essentially a defensive behavior, and that dogs or other animals mark territory as a way of kind of protecting themselves and protecting their territory. So generally speaking, if a dog is doing a lot of it, and particularly if the dog is resilient in doing it, even though you've done a lot to try and change it, the dog probably has a lot of anxiety about something, so conditioned relaxation would be a good thing. To the question about, isn't it illogical to click and reward a behavior that you don't like? Apparently, yes. But actually, there's a way that you can use it to change the behavior. So I'll describe that in a moment. But the first thing I want to say is, to any of the trainers who are thinking, well, that's just absolutely wrong, it's absolutely crazy, it would never work, it's a stupid idea, I would say two things. First of all, in this case, the behavior already exists, and apparently exists at a fairly intense level. So if you were to try what I'm about to suggest and it didn't work, so the hell what? The dog's already doing the behavior. You're not teaching a dog that didn't mark in the house to start marking in the house. And if you had a dog that did it a very little bit, I would try lots of other things first. But in this case, the dog apparently does it quite a bit, and they've tried lots of stuff. So why not give another way of thinking a try? The second thing I would say to the people who say it doesn't make sense and it could never work is, you're wrong. It might not work, but it certainly could work. I do this all the time with all kinds of behavior, and people are routinely surprised at the change. So if you want to try it, pick a dog and a behavior they don't care that much about and experiment with it some and try it. So first thing is that it's important to understand that what I suggested, which was bridging and rewarding the undesired behavior, or clicking and rewarding, is only a first step. A lot of times, especially for balance trainers, when they're looking at suggestions by more reward-based trainers, or even purely positive trainers, they often object to the advice because they're evaluating the advice based on if that were what you were always going to do with the dog. And I think one of the things that's really helpful to understand is that very often in reward-based solutions to problem behavior, the beginning does not look like the end. And so trying to evaluate in a beginning step by what it would look like if you did that forever is not a rational way to evaluate those types of solutions. A really easy way to think about this is to think about toilet training a child. When you toilet train a child, we intuitively know that lots of the steps that we do in toilet training are temporary, and the child is not going to always do that step. And we don't freak out about somebody doing a particular step because what if the child were doing that when it was 12 years of age? We kind of basically know the child's not going to be. So one example is I walked into my younger son's house a week or two ago, and he has a 2- and a 3-year-old child, and so we're right in the middle of toilet training with both of them. And in the middle of his living room is a plastic toilet. And it's not a toy, it's there for his older daughter to be able to pee or poop in. And if you're not at all familiar with toilet training and raising kids, it sounds kind of crazy. But one of the very common steps for children in toilet training is a point at which they have started to develop the idea of how to go to the bathroom on a toilet. But they have not yet really developed the awareness and the self-control to interrupt their play or whatever they might be doing and choose to go somewhere else to go to the toilet to go to the bathroom. Very commonly, if we didn't have the intermediate step of having a potty right there, they would realize that they need to go much too late and end up peeing or pooping their pants as they're headed towards the bathroom. And what happens at that point is the child had the right idea, it recognized that it had to go to the bathroom, and it started to head there, but it wasn't rewarded for the behavior, it was actually frustrated because it gets halfway there and the child poops itself or pees itself. And a child would only be doing this stage of behavior because they've gotten to a point where they're starting to prefer not peeing or pooping, in their diaper or whatever they have on. So when you think about this potty there, if you think about a child that's at this point in training, it can make great sense. Oh, well, if the child could go right there, right now, they probably would be rewarded for the right choice. They would go, oh my God, I gotta pee, and they'd go, and it would work out great. But if you look at that step and you evaluate it as if that's what the child was always going to do and it's what the parents were always going to do, well, you'd be horrified at the idea of a 12-year-old using this little plastic potty in the middle of the living room. And in fact, you might, call some behavioral therapists if that's what was happening. So it's important to understand that what I was suggesting, clicking and rewarding to the actual behavior that you don't like, is only a first step. And it has to be evaluated as a first step in a process, not, what if this was all you ever did? So, to the second poster's question, there's no question if we started clicking and rewarding to the dog marking, and we continue to do that for several weeks, the dog would think that marking was itself a trick. It could go do that, and we would click and reward it. So now it would have another reason to click and reward. It's important to understand, even though this isn't what I'm suggesting, there's another strategy that you could use by doing that, which is that could relieve the stress in the dog that's related to the urinating, to the marking. And 2 or 3 weeks into that, you could start rewarding alternate behavior when the dog looks, or cueing alternate behavior when the dog looks like it's going to mark. That's not what I'm suggesting here, but that could be a strategy that could work because it could relieve a lot of the anxiety around the behavior. The cost of that would be you'd have to deal with the dog being in the house a lot in the meantime. In this case right now, the dog's already doing it, so not such a huge thing. But what we have to think about in the step that I suggested is that it's step 1, and we're doing step 1 to set up step 2. So in step 1, what's important is that the trainer clicks the instant the dog begins to mark, not watches the dog mark and after the dog's finished they click and reward. So what will happen very commonly in a situation like this If the dog has already been clicker trained or it's learned verbal bridges or whatever else, experiencing the bridge while it's doing the behavior will immediately make the dog think about getting the reward. And what we should do when we click is throw the reward for the dog, not call the dog back to us or anything else. Just the dog hears the click, boom, the reward comes. So in this case, just as an example, if the dog were marking on the end of the couch, when I clicked, or in my case said yes, I would actually throw the food off the corner of the couch, so the animal would definitely notice it. Because the animal does not intend to empty its whole bladder, it only intends to urinate for a short time, it's very likely that when you do that, you'll interrupt the behavior and the animal will get the food. So what happens is, yes, the animal still marks, but if, let's say, 5 to 10 times, you catch the dog the instant it starts to mark, and you click and reward or bridge and reward, and a clicker would generally be better for this. This particular case has a sharper response. What you will most likely notice at some point is that the animal looks like it's about to mark, but before it does it, the idea comes into its head that you might click and reward, and the animal will hesitate and commonly look towards you. The moment it does that, the animal just did something new. What it did was, it thought about marking on something, and it did something else. It didn't do the something else because it thinks that marking is wrong. It didn't do the something else because it thinks you're going to throw something at it or squirt it or yell at it or whatever else. The pattern of behavior was interrupted by the idea of a reward. So now, let's just say we have this happen. The animal goes over, looks at the couch, sniffs it, looks like he's going to pee on it, but he looks up at us. Now we bridge and reward that. And now we're in step 2. And now what we've just bridged is exactly everything else you were trying to get by all the other training you were doing, which is the dog having the idea of marking, but choosing not to do it. And so what's happened is, what you did in step 1 by clicking and rewarding the instant the dog started the behavior, created a new expectation relative to the behavior, which is, hey, somewhere in here when I do this, they might click and reward. So now while the animal's doing what it's always done, which is thinking about marking, and it begins the action, another thought comes into its head at the same time, which is, wow, are you going to click and reward? If we did that 100 times, we'd have a dog that marked as a circus behavior. He's like, hey, look what I'm doing, you should click and reward me. But in this case, what happens is the expectation introduces hesitation into the behavior. And now when we see the hesitation, we click and reward. And what we can do fairly quickly is, now as we see the hesitation, we don't immediately click and reward. Maybe we hesitate a half a second, maybe we hesitate a second. And then the question is the animal drawn more into the expectation of the reward, or does it go, oh well, I guess you're not going to click and reward, I'm going to pee. And if our timing is good and we go in very small increments, what's much more likely to happen is that when we don't immediately click and reward after we've done it a few times, so we've clicked and rewarded for step 2, which is that the animal interrupts its own behavior out of expectation of the reward, now we just delay the click and reward a little bit. And as an example, the animal might have been almost ready to lift its leg, or even have lifted its leg but not yet peed, when it looks at us. We've clicked and rewarded that a bunch of times. Now if we wait, what's very likely to happen is the animal puts its leg back down, because it's like, hey, weren't you going to reward me? Now we click and reward that. And what's happening is by our click and reward, or our bridge and reward, we're starting to guide the animal further and further from the behavior that we didn't like. But if we weren't willing to bridge and reward the initial behavior that we didn't like, we'll let the truck go by. If we weren't willing to bridge and reward the initial behavior that we didn't like, we wouldn't have created what causes the change in behavior, which is this expectation of a possible reward that starts to interfere with or interrupt the flow of behavior. So we do the first step to create that new thought. Step 2, we see some hesitation. in doing the behavior, which was caused by our initial click and reward at the instant the behavior started. And now we click and reward for the hesitation. Step 3, we pause a little bit before our click and reward when we see the hesitation in the behavior, and we wait for some further change or just for longer hesitation. And now what happens is we're leading the animal further away from the behavior. And in approaching the behavior this way, if it's an anxiety-driven behavior, we're not just teaching new behavior, but we're reducing the anxiety. So, not everybody's cup of tea. I understand a lot of people object to the idea, but they are objecting to it generally on the same basis that someone who has never trained with an electronic collar objects to some really good electronic collar training. They're objecting on what they think is going to happen, but you as the trainer who's done it many times knows no, the dog doesn't get more nervous because I stim the dog away from a behavior and then reward it. The dog gets less nervous. So for those of you who maybe feel that people don't listen to your ideas about e-collar training, this might be an example to open your mind and think about a different way of training that you would naturally object to, and not because you're crazy. You have a logical objection, but maybe look into it a little deeper and think about it, play with it, see how it works for you.
Thanks.